Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last webinar of 2022. This webinar is going to be about what it means to be in a clinical trial. My name is Dova Levin, and I am the Senior Director for Program Management and Education at the Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Habib with us. Dr. Habib is a neurology specialist at the University of California, Irvine, working out of the Orange County office. Dr. Habib completed a residency at New York Presbyterian Hospital's Weill Medical College of Cornell University. He is board certified in neuromuscular medicine. Dr. Habib also serves on the steering committee for MGFA's scientific session and will be this year's chair. The scientific session serves to educate neuromuscular and regular neurologists on the latest science in myasthenia gravis. Before we start, I just want to thank our sponsors, our national presenting sponsors, Alexion, argenx, and UCB, and also our national sponsors, Horizon, Janssen, and Caballetto Bio. I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to let Dr. Habib share his screen. And you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the MGFA for this opportunity to speak to all of you about what the nuts and bolts of clinical trials are. And really, I want to hopefully not spend too much time talking about this and leave a good chunk of time at the end for any questions anybody in the audience might have. To get things started, these are my disclosures. I receive research support and honoraria from different companies that are conducting clinical trials or have products available for the treatment of myasthenia gravis. And just off the bat, I wanted to start off with saying it's really a fantastic time in the field of myasthenia gravis. The last few years have seen an absolute explosion of clinical trials taking place in this space. And there are a dizzying number of clinical trials, which is just fascinating. They're all targeting many different aspects of myasthenia. If we look back at the history of clinical trials in myasthenia up until even the 2010s, a lot of the therapies that we were trying were really borrowed from other spaces within medicine, particularly autoimmune fields like rheumatology. And in this in the last few years, there have been therapies that have specifically been looking at targeting mechanisms that are known to be involved in myasthenia in particular. And some of the trials have had myasthenia as the first disease indication to be studied. So that's really, really exciting stuff. It obviously leads to an expanding array of therapies that becomes available to us for really helping patients with myasthenia. And there is a shift in the treatment paradigm, whereas before a lot of the treatment was focused on trying to keep the disease at bay and keep patients out of hospital. I think the paradigm has shifted more towards talking about side effect profiles and efficacy and safety of all the therapies that we use. So how do we get to the point of having all these therapies available to us? And there are a couple different terms I'm gonna use here. So what this slide talks about are the stages of drug development. And within this, later on, we'll talk about the phases of clinical trials. So as you can imagine, the very first stage of drug development starts with finding a candidate drug or therapy. And that is usually starting off in a laboratory. where you're looking at disease mechanisms, targeting those disease mechanisms. How do you specifically target specific mechanisms that may be at play in a disease? This then leads to the preclinical research stage, where you take the target molecule and look at its safety and efficacy when given to either healthy animals or animals that have the disease model within them. So in the case of myasthenia, that might be the experimental autoimmune myasthenia gravis model. When you demonstrate good safety and efficacy in the preclinical stage, that then leads to the clinical research stage, which is the most critical part. And that is human subject research, which is where all of us come in. Excuse me. As you go through the various clinical phases within the clinical research stage, hopefully you end up going through them and get to the point where the data from the clinical trials can be submitted to the FDA for their review and approval of the drug for the specific indication. The clinical research work does not stop at that point. Once a drug is approved, there is often post-marketing surveillance at the least, or other clinical trials that aim to refine what we know about the use of these medications to specific target populations within specific stages of a disease, that kind of stuff. What is a clinical trial? And this is taken directly from the FDA's website. So it's really, really important to highlight that clinical trials are voluntary research studies. There really should be no pressure, force, or coercion involved in participation during a clinical trial by patients. Really, you are helping us answer specific questions about the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of these medications as we try them. And all these factors, safety and effectiveness, are the critical words that we're focusing on. And I found this very interesting because I'd never thought of it in those terms, but the FDA reminds us that it is important to remember the FDA does not conduct clinical trials. It only has oversight when it comes to approval of clinical trials and their medications. So what is the purpose of a clinical trial? Really, the clinical trials are designed and targeted to talk about the safety of a drug within a group of patients. It is looking at whether the side effects are tolerable or severe. And obviously, it is looking at efficacy in terms of treating a disease. So all three of these are very key words when we are talking about what we're hoping to achieve in clinical trials. And at the end of the day, all of them are towards the goal of helping make patients feel better, patients who are suffering from the disease. Phase 3 trials, actually, I think my slides went out of order here. I'm going to go here. I'll come back to that one. We talked about the stages. Now, this is talking about stage 3, which is clinical research. And within that, we talk about phases of clinical studies. So these are typically thought of as phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials. So in phase, what the chevrons on the left are showing you are percentages of drugs that make from a phase 1 study down into the phase 2 study. So that's about 70% funneling down to a phase 2. Once they pass muster in a phase 2, about 33, so 1 out of 3 drugs may go on to a phase 3. And from a phase 3, another third may actually get approval. So you can see that it's quite a funnel down process, and majority of the therapies that are making it into the clinical stage are actually not going to get FDA approval. So in a phase 1 study, typically that involves healthy volunteers in certain disease states, such as cancer therapies, because of the potential toxicity for these target therapies. They are not usually given to healthy volunteers, but rather patients with the target disease. They typically involve a very small number of subjects. And the main goals for a phase 1 trial are to look at what happens to the drug in the body and what the body does to the drug. So those are the pharmacokinetic and the pharmacodynamic aspects. And these are typically short duration studies. They're really trying to get a sense of how is this going to be dosed and how is it going to be tolerated and what's going to do in the study, what needs monitoring during subsequent phases. In a phase 2 clinical trial, you have a larger group of patients, and this time around, it's usually subjects are within the target disease population. In other common diseases, phase 2 trials will typically enroll 100 or more subjects. Myasthenia being a rare disorder, phase 2 studies in myasthenia in the last several years have had between 14 and 44 subjects enrolled in the studies. The durations of phase 2 trials are typically a little bit longer than phase 1 studies. And often they do a randomized trial design. And the purpose of a phase 2 study shifts a little bit from the phase 1 study. You're now beginning to look at, does the drug work and is it safe in the target population? Some of the phase 2 studies are also still looking at dosing regimens in a little bit more detail, so that can inform the dose that's going to be used in a phase 3 study. And the dosing of the drug is usually double blind. What that means is that neither the subjects nor the researchers know who got actual drug, and they can have different types of dosing regimens. And in a phase 3 trial, then you go on to have your much larger group. Typically in MG trials, this has been in the 100 to 200 range of patients enrolled in phase 3 studies. The durations are much longer than phase 2 studies, typically at least a couple to 3 years at a minimum that patients would be enrolled in this study. And that's divided into different parts within the phase 3 trial. By design, these are randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, because this is really the gold standard of how clinical trials should be done. And the purpose of a phase 3 study is to look at the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of these. I'm going to back up a little bit and just talk about what this is. So most of the publications you will see will include these 3 key phrases. So what does randomization mean? That's a method of, so all of these words are really meant to eliminate bias within a clinical trial so that the results are truly as representative as could be in a study. Randomization means that people are randomly selected to be part of either the control group, which would be getting the placebo, or the investigational group, which would be getting the active therapy being tested. Double blind means that really nobody in the trial, either on the administration side or the receiving side, should have an idea of who's getting the actual therapy and who's getting placebo. And placebo control is evident. Sorry about the jumping back and forth. So what about, what are the risks and benefits of being in a clinical trial to you, the participant? The potential benefits obviously are access to medications that hopefully are better in terms of their efficacy, safety, tolerability. It is a way of increasing the options for treatment available for yourself, participating in clinical trials. There is a sense of empowerment in playing a more active role in your own health by being a part of cutting edge clinical trials and research. The earlier access is actually a very key point, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But really, this is an opportunity to be one of the first people to receive the treatment. And another important benefit is during a clinical trial, you are under very close follow-up and observation by the clinical research team. So visits are a lot more frequent, and you have many more touch points with the research team and your healthcare providers than you would under usual circumstances. And not to minimize the last point, but there is certainly a sense of altruistic contribution towards the care of not only yourself, but of others like you with the disorder being treated. Of course, clinical trials are not without risk. That's a big factor that is being looked at during a clinical trial. These are medications that have not been used by a large number of people. And so potential risks and side effects are certainly there. That is part of the reason that monitoring is done so closely during a clinical trial. There is the potential that the treatment that is being tried does not work for you in particular, but even for the disease in general, or that it works for others in the clinical trial, but not for you. Treatment may not be as effective as some of the current treatment options are. So you may have actually experienced better benefit from other therapies that you've tried versus the treatment that is being tested. There is a significant impact on lifestyle because of the very heavy involvement with visits in clinical trials that is required as part of the clinical trials. And there is the potential that you may only get the placebo treatment and not receive active therapy. Put the asterisks there because we've been very fortunate in myasthenia studies. None of the studies that have occurred and completed in the past several years and those that are ongoing have had that situation. All of them have had an open label extension in which even patients who were on placebo did receive active therapy. And as the open label extension typically lasts much longer than the double-blind period, your exposure to the medication is typically much longer than the placebo period. So just to talk about, what is the life cycle of drugs going through these different phases, and instead of giving just national averages for all sorts of trials, I thought it would be easiest to actually put it in the MG context. So here you have the three drugs that have been approved within the past 5 to 6 years for the treatment of myasthenia. If you look at eculizumab, the phase 2 study, so this is treated MG patients, not even covering the preclinical phase or the phase 1 studies that were done. That was another several years. If you look at just the phase 2 studies, the phase 2 study started in October of 2008. And the phase 3 study ended in June of 2016. When I say end, I mean the double blind period. And it took another year plus before before eculizumab actually received FDA approval. So just from the start of phase 2 to the approval date was a 9-year period. For efgartigimod, that time frame shrunk a little bit. So the phase 2 study started in December of 2016. The phase 3 basic part ended in April of 2020. And the drug received approval a year and a half later in December last year. So that time frame is 5 years. Ravulizumab seems to be even shorter, but the difference here is that ravulizumab did not have a phase 2 study in myasthenia. Ravulizumab had already been undergoing trials and approval in other disease indications. So it went directly to a phase 3 study. And that's why the time frame seems short. But even if you look at when the trial first part ended and trial of the FDA approval, that's still another year. So point here is that it takes quite some time before drugs go in, drugs that are in clinical trials enter into the market. And that really is, so clinical trial participants really are the only ones who have the ability or the option to get that therapy during that whole approval phase of the drug. This I thought was an interesting graphic taken from the website listed here for a survey of close to 6,000 patients who were participating in clinical trials. And I was surprised that the majority of patients were really doing it more out of a selfless motivation rather than, focusing on their own health. That was just an astounding bit of information and very appreciative of all that patients do to help us advance the therapy landscape. So it's very, very important to keep in mind that clinical trials have the potential for having adverse events. And there are multiple layers to safeguard patient health within a clinical trial. And it begins first and foremost with what's considered the patient bill of rights. And this information is taken directly from the UCI website. And I just want to highlight the things that we are required really in this, the right thing to do when asking patients to participate in clinical trials. So you have the right to know about the nature and the purpose of the study. Why is this study being conducted? What is involved in the study? What are the procedures involved? What is known about the potential for side effects? Are there any procedures in the clinical trial that may potentially give discomfort? Is there any surgical procedure? Are there multiple needle sticks? Are there any invasive devices that are required for monitoring? Do I have to do certain things that may cause me pain? MRI scans, for example, people having difficulty laying flat. Fortunately, myasthenia trials don't involve a lot of MR imaging. What would be the potential for benefit of being in the clinical trial and receiving the therapy? Are there any alternatives to these therapies? What's currently available in the market? What can I get? And how does the clinical trial therapy weigh out against the therapies that are already available commercially? What sort of medical treatment and complication would you be receiving if there is a complication while you're enrolled in the study? That's a very important thing. If you have a hospitalization for any reason, what goes into the coverage there. Um, you have to have the chance to ask questions. Again, typically the way that we do it at UCI is, we provide information for the clinical trial. So usually it's providing the informed consent form with the instruction that you do not sign that. It's really a document to help you familiarize yourself with what's involved in the clinical trial, get enough time or as much time as is needed in order to think about that trial and ask us all the questions that you want to ask before getting into the clinical trial. You absolutely have the right to refuse to participate in a research study. Research participation is entirely voluntary. There should be no force, no coercion, no incentive to be in a clinical trial other than the incentive of getting a better therapy. And it is imperative to receive a copy of the signed and dated consent form once you do decide to sign and join a clinical trial. There are other safeguards in place as well. So the Institutional Review Board traditionally used to be a body within each research institution, such as UC Irvine, which is made up of a group of typically physicians and scientists with the sole purpose of making sure that patient safety is not compromised. That is they're not looking at the scientific merit of the research study. That's not what their job is. Their job is to ensure patient safety, equity, inclusivity, all those things. The study will typically have a data safety and monitoring board, which is tasked with reviewing all the data that is being collected throughout the study at frequent time points to make sure that there isn't a signal coming through that jeopardizes patient safety. Similarly, medical monitor is involved in the day-to-day activities in a clinical trial, and their job primarily is to review the safety labs that are coming through, discussing with individual investigators at sites when they have questions, and compiling all the data for the data safety and monitoring board. And then the ultimate responsibility for your care and safety lies with the site investigator, who has oversight of the clinical trial in entirety at the site that you are participating in. So again, multiple layers with the main primary goal being that of patient safety. Informed consent is, again, a very, very critical part of the enrollment in a clinical trial. And this is language taken directly, again, from the FDA website. What is informed consent? Participants need to be well informed about what will be done to them during the study. They need to have an understanding of what the protocol entails and how the drug works, what the risks and benefits are, and again, critically important, that participation and enrollment in a clinical trial and continuation in a clinical trial is entirely voluntary. I haven't said this before, but the idea behind informed consent is that you can withdraw informed consent at any time during a clinical trial. It's not in the best interest of the clinical trial for you to withdraw, because there is a limited number of participants that are included. And if participants drop out in large numbers, that compromises the integrity of the clinical trial and the validity of the data that's obtained in the clinical trial. But even so, we as primary investigators, our primary task is to ensure patient safety. So if the investigators also have any concern that their patients' health and safety may be adversely affected during a clinical trial, they have the ability and decision-making power to actually withdraw the patients from the clinical trials. Of course, this is always ideally done in the context of a conversation between the patients and the investigators, and coming to a agreed upon decision to withdraw from a study. So what are the things to look for when you are considering participation in a clinical trial? Obviously, apart from the potential benefit from the therapy that is being tried in the clinical trial, it's important to pay attention to the logistical details of a clinical trial as well. How long will the trial last? And again, the trials are typically split into two parts: the double-blind phase, which is the placebo-controlled part, and the open-label extension periods. Typically in the MG trials, the double-blind phase has been between 3 to 6 months in duration. The open-label extensions go on for a few years. And the purpose of an open-label extension really from the clinical trial side is to see continued benefit of the drug over a longer period of time, have greater amount of information about the safety and tolerability of the medication. And it's a way of ensuring that participants who benefited from the therapy and want to continue on the therapy are able to continue on that therapy while the administrative authorities are deciding on drug approval or not. It's important to look at the schema for trial visits. How often are you going to have to be in the clinic or at the research center in order to, while you're participating in the study? Typically, the study visits are front-loaded, so there are more study visits early on in the double-blind phase and during the double-blind phase. Once you go into the open-label extension, typically the visits are more spread out and more manageable. Also important to see how long each study visit may be. These can vary tremendously in length. Some visits can be just 1 to 2 hours, others can take an entire day. And of course, this is important because this is time you're taking away from your daily activities, professions, family life, all of that, in order to be doing these visits. Thanks to the pandemic, there has been a dramatic change in how we think about trial administration, and remote and virtual visits really have come into play, and every trial is trying to incorporate these as best as they can and think about minimizing the burden of going to study sites for the patients as best as they can. And then lastly, what are the assessments that are going to be undertaken during a study visit? Are you going to have blood draws? Are you going to have tissue specimens collected for other reasons? What testing will you need to do? Breathing tests, EKGs, those kind of things. Typically in MG studies, the visits include minimally invasive procedures, so things like blood draws for the most part, and mostly EKGs are physical assessments, the scales, and breathing tests. So usually they're not invasive in any way or uncomfortable in that sense. Well, so now you've decided you want to be in a clinical trial and you go through the informed consent form and get enrolled in the clinical trial. But what happens then? Well, in the first few weeks, you have a period which is the screening period. And that leads to your baseline visit. During the screening period, your medical history is being looked at in great detail to make sure there aren't any contraindications that related to the drug that would be a problem with participation. So for example, if you have had a recent infection, a lot of these therapies we're trying are modulating the immune system. So you don't want to be starting an immune modulatory drug from when having had a recent infection. The patients who've had a thymectomy is a very frequent criteria that's looked at. And typically, if you've had a thymectomy within the past 6 months or 12 months, that becomes an exclusion criteria. So all of this is being looked at. You get blood testing done to make sure that there aren't any problems there that would preclude your participation in a clinical trial. So there is still a lot to be done from when you sign the informed consent form and are officially enrolled in the study to the point that you are actually getting the treatment visit in the study with the baseline visit. And so there are factors, again, primarily related to patient safety and to data safety that play into the inclusion and exclusion criteria. There is a challenge with study quotas too. Fortunately, most of the MG trials are now trying to enroll patients outside of the acetylcholine receptor antibody subgroup. So they are trying to enroll patients with MuSK myasthenia or LRP4 antibody myasthenia, and even seronegative. It depends on the underlying mechanism that is being targeted. But for the MuSK, LRP4, and seronegative groups, there is usually a limited number. So if the study ends up enrolling that number and you also are part of that group, you may not get into the study because that number has been reached. And that's what the study quota is talking about. So once you are signed and involved in a clinical trial, what are the expectations from a participant? Well, again, every little bit of information is critically important for the integrity of the trial. So compliance with study visits is very important. Typically, there is a little bit of wiggle room, so it's not hard and fast. You have to be there on this day only, and that's the only day you can come. There's usually a 1 to 2 day grace period on either side to accommodate for life, for everybody's schedules, for holidays, for strikes, for transportation issues, for weather issues, those kind of things. Compliance with the medication that is being tried, whether it is active therapy or placebo, again, participants and the clinical trial team wouldn't know either way. And the reporting of side effects is also really important. And it's interesting in the sense that there are many things that happen to us in day-to-day life that you would think, well, this is not related in any way to the study. But yet, every single thing that happens, it's important to inform the study team. And it's important for the study team to document anything that happens. Your blood pressure went up. You had a flu. A subject falls down and has a scratch or a fracture. Any of those things that happen during a clinical trial need to be reported in the clinical trial. Of course, it is at the investigator's discretion for the in most instances to say whether or not they think that the particular event or adverse effect is related to the study drug or not. So we do have the ability to decide in conversation with our participants whether or not the drug was or the trial was responsible for the side effect. It's also important when you're seeing other providers to inform them that you are in a clinical trial. Of course, there's limited information that is available to be given to them. The other part about that is there are certain things that could result in unblinding inadvertently during a clinical trial. As an example, if a medication is decreasing your antibody levels and the antibody levels are checked inadvertently outside of the clinical trial, then that could result potentially in unblinding in letting you know whether or not you're on active drug. So those are the kind of things that are important to keep in mind. I want to end with this slide. There are some amazing resources out there with regards to clinical trials. The most reliable place to look for clinical trials that are ongoing, that have completed, that were terminated, all of that is the federal website called clinicaltrials.gov. Any clinical trial occurring in the US has to register with the clinicaltrials.gov. They have a specific study number that usually starts with NCT with a long number behind it. So every trial has its own unique identity. You can look up information about the clinical trial, about the criteria for inclusion in the clinical trial and exclusion, the clinical trial sites in a particular area, all of that stuff. The FDA website has some very nice and easy to understand information about what it means to be involved in clinical trials. I found this nice other website, Clinical Trials Explained, that talks you through the different aspects of it and the YouTube video that's listed there. And then we have the UCI Clinical Research Group's website as well with more information. And that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing.
So we have a couple of questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Habib. We have a couple of questions. I don't know if you can see the Q&A box. Look at the very bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A. It has 2 questions right now. If not, I can read it. Do you see them?
All right. So Harry, your question is, do clinical trials finish when the drug is finally approved, or do they continue? If they do continue, do you know if there is any post after using the drug clinical trials for efgartigimod, also known as Vyvgart? Great question, Harry. It depends on what is being looked at in the clinical trials. So Vyvgart, as an example, typically when phase 3 trials are in their open label extension and the drug gets approved, patients will gradually be transitioned over to the commercial drug if they choose to continue in receiving that therapy. It doesn't have to happen immediately as soon as the drug gets approved. I will give you the example of ravulizumab. Ultomiris got approved in the summer, and some of the patients are still in that transition period. They haven't gotten over to the commercial drug. The second part of the question, is that there may not necessarily be continuation of that same trial, but Vyvgart, for example, had other trials that were looking at different dosing regimens. For example, of one arm is the way that it was dosed in the REGAIN study, in the phase 3 study, and the second arm is getting once every 2-week infusion. So it's a different dosing regimen. And there are other different trials related to Vyvgart. So not that same trial that's continuing on, but different trials, but still in clinical trial state. I hope that answers the question. I'm going to move to the second one. Can patients who clearly benefited from the treatment continue open label extension treatments even if the drug fails to receive FDA approval? That's actually a very important question. Often that is a no. If the FDA says a no to approving the drug, typically the drug is no longer available, and especially if there is a safety concern with the drug, they have to stop the drug. Often, though, the companies will make the choice of terminating the clinical trial, and so the drug availability will halt at that point. So usually that's how it plays out. John asked, is there any evidence that incidences of MG have increased in recent years, and therefore the number of trials aimed specifically at MG have increased? There is an indication that MG incidence is increasing, particularly in what's termed the old or late onset myasthenia gravis, that is loosely at age 45 or age 55, age 50 plus myasthenia. There is indication that there are the incidence is increasing there, but that's not the driver for the increase in the number of clinical trials. I think the driver for the increase in clinical trials is because we have technological advances that can target the therapies. Myasthenia also presents a very interesting backdoor to FDA approval. What I mean by that is that different rules apply when you are doing trials in a common disorder versus a rare disorder. So in rare disorders, you need one positive phase 3 study in order to apply for FDA approval, whereas the rules are much tighter and you need much bigger trials when you're talking about common conditions. And obviously that means a whole difference, a huge difference in the infrastructure required for clinical trials, in the investment in those clinical trials and that kind of stuff. So I think that the MG space is seeing an explosion in clinical trials because there are a lot of advances in the therapies that can be used. Mike's question is, I live in Seal Beach, which is close to UCI. Is there any advantage for potential subjects to living near your research center? It is most definitely easier in terms of the visits to be close to the site where you're undertaking your research. Again, research visits can be as frequent as once a week, and if you are 2 hours away, then it's a big burden on the participants to be doing that kind of commute that frequently. So it is certainly better when you are closer to the research site.
So I had a question. When you have a healthy patient, it seems very scary to go off your medication to go into a clinical trial. How often do you have to? I know every clinical trial is different, but how often are patients asked to stop the therapy that they're on in order to participate?
Thank you, Nova. I'm sorry I missed that part. That's actually a very key part in clinical trial participation. In general, in MG trials, the therapies that people are asked to stop using are IVIG and plasma exchange. In general, if you're on steroids, the immunosuppressants like azathioprine or Imuran, mycophenolate or Cellcept, methotrexate, any of those, you can typically continue on those. Those are what are considered standard of care therapies, and you typically are allowed to continue on those. Now, the caveat with that is what's happening in the last few years, with Vyvgart being approved last December and ravulizumab. Are those therapies allowed to be continued? It really depends on the clinical trial, whether or not you can continue. I know of one particular trial where they specifically allowed patients to continue on the complement inhibitor therapy. And again, if, for example, you were in the clinical trial or looking at clinical trial for the FcRn inhibitor, then yes, you would be required to come off of Vyvgart if you were on Vyvgart. So like you said, it depends on what the target agent is. But in general, you can continue with the prednisone, steroids, and the immunosuppressive therapies.
And the other question that kind of goes along with this is, when should a patient not go on, not volunteer for a clinical trial?
So I think there are several different aspects for that question. The first and obvious one is if your myasthenia is difficult to control and is fluctuating a lot and affects you significantly. What I mean by that is it's affecting your breathing or swallowing or speech. Those are what we would classify as MGFA class 4, so severe disease. Typically, we're not enrolling those patients because, again, there is the potential that you would be getting placebo in the study, and it's not feasible. It's not safe to have a patient be in a 3-month or 6-month double-blind phase where they may be getting placebo while they are having so much problem with their myasthenia. Excuse me. Other considerations are logistical considerations. How easy and feasible is it for you to be taking time off work, to be traveling to the site, to be admitted to the hospital for a couple of days to initiate the trial? So what is the feasibility from your day-to-day life in participating in the clinical trial? So those are the kind of the factors that are at play. And I think this circles back to the point about having that discussion, having the time to think through all of these things before signing the consent form. Really, my approach is I keep saying, what other questions do you have? What other questions do you have? Because I really want people to have all the information available to them before they make the decision to participate in clinical trials. I do want to also say, without all of your help, the field can't move forward. We have all these trials, and we need your help in moving the field forward, in getting these better and safer and better tolerated therapies out in the market. So I really, really appreciate all the help that all of you give in moving the field forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Habib, for this. It was a great presentation, and we will have it on our website for people to view later. So you can even refer people there if you'd like, when they have questions about clinical trials. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask, I'm happy to share the slides with you if you want, and yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a good rest of your day, and we will continue with our webinars, research webinars, and wellness webinars next year. Have a good one. Thank you.